Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Ray, and welcome to the RayWenderlich.com podcast. In this podcast, we'll keep you up to date with the latest app development tech talk. Now, here are your hosts, Drew Freeman and Alex Sullivan.
Thanks, Ray. This is the Ray Wenderlich podcast. Welcome to episode 6 for season 10. This episode was recorded on Saturday, the 21st of April, for release on the 6th of May, 2020. This episode is sponsored by CloudBees Rollout.
CloudBees Rollout is where developers come to ship changes at will.
When you have a solution to manage feature flags at scale, you're empowered to continuously and intelligently roll out changes as soon as they are code complete. On any platform, even mobile.
Decouple development from code releases for real-time change control. Roll back only the changes you want, toggle features, use multivariate flags for A/B testing, and nix misbehaving features with a kill switch.
Sign up for CloudBees Rollout today and get 20% off. Visit https://ray-wenderlich-offer and fill out the form on the right. We will email you a discount code that you can use to access CloudBees Rollout for completely free.
Feel free to start a trial and use your discount code when checking out after your trial expires in 14 days. And we thank CloudBees Rollout for sponsoring this episode of the Ray Wenderlich podcast.
Right. I'm Drew Freeman, here with my ever-ready, with no shakeups co-host, Alex Sullivan.
Thanks, Drew. Our guest for this episode is Victoria Gonda. Victoria is an Android engineer and technical author. The conferences she has spoken at have been an enjoyable way to connect with the technical community and exchange information with others.
On this episode, we'll check our work with test-driven development for Android, and then Alex will talk about experimenting with coroutines. Victoria, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, I have to ask, first of all, the question I've been asking all of our guests is, where are you located?
I am in Chicago.
Okay, so you're only an hour off from us.
Mm-hmm.
It's about 9 p.m. here on the East Coast. It's about 8 p.m. where you are, as we're rolling this recording here. How has the weather been?
Not too bad. Starting to warm up. Still a little bit chilly, but in general, not too bad. We've had some good sunny days.
We've actually seen we actually saw a couple of snowflakes today. We had some really cold and heavily windy weather today.
Oof.
We had the first real snow of the year here in Boston. Like the first overnight snow to stick.
A little bit late.
Yeah, feels right. Feels right.
Well, that's what happens when nobody's outside. Yeah, Victoria, how are you dealing with shelter in place and all of that other things that's going on during COVID?
Going as best as I can. Thankfully, work for me hasn't been impacted too much. I work remotely all of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I already had a nice at-home office set up. It's definitely weird with everything outside of work. So just taking it one day at a time.
So what do you typically do when you're not stuck in the house? What are the things that you like to do to pass the time?
A lot of the things that I do when I'm not doing like the conferences and writing and stuff that were mentioned is I like doing like stuff walking around in the city. Also, if you're watching the video, there's a whole bunch of board games behind me. So love playing board games. Also, I'll also like to hang out at home. I like reading. I have a cat and a hedgehog who keep me company.
Ooh, a hedgehog.
Yeah.
A cat and a hedgehog.
Yes, both.
How do they deal with each other?
The hedgehog just kind of doesn't care about the cat, and the cat is ever curious about the hedgehog, even though they lived together for a couple years. So the cat is like, "Ooh, what is this thing? Oh, it's Pokey," and sometimes never remembers that it's Pokey.
Now,
what's the care like for a hedgehog?
You like have to like clean the cage and stuff like the same as like maybe like a rabbit. Clean the cage, give it food and water. You also want to like take it out and like socialize it every day. And that looks a little bit different depending on like the personality of the hedgehogs. Some like to explore more, some like to cuddle. So just making sure.
Cuddling with a hedgehog. That sounds a little tough.
But when they're relaxed, their quills are all nice and calm, and you can pet them. So that helps.
Not so prickly.
Right.
So, not to get too personal, besides the cat and the hedgehog, are you forced to shelter alone, or do you have friends or someone to keep you company?
I'm here with my fiance and my roommate.
Well, that's good. I mean, at least that gives you somebody to stumble over for the next couple of months.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it's that mixed, it's that double-edged sword. It's like, on the one hand, I'm not in the house completely alone. On the other hand, I'm going to kill people really, really soon. All right. So I see the board games. I just recently got turned on to a website that basically is mostly board games that you can play online. I have to find the site for that, but I'll put it in the show notes. It's a really cool site that lets you play board games with other people via the net. And
Nice.
There seems to be a trend now of people who are playing board games and opening Zoom at the same time.
I like that. That's nice.
So you basically are almost getting there. It's just so close.
Not quite.
Right.
So close, but not quite. There's also there's a Steam game. I don't remember the name of it. Is it RPG Maker, where there's like lots of plugins that you? And it's probably not RPG Maker.
Maybe a tabletop simulator?
Yeah, that sounds about right. And you can have like all these different, plugins or whatever, downloadable content for lots of different board games. So that's a nice way to do it.
Okay. Now, did I read somewhere that you also dance?
Yes, I've been dancing since I was in kindergarten. I danced all through college, and now I mostly take dance classes just for fun and exercise. But I was dancing and performing all through college.
What kind of dance?
It's ranged from ballet, tap, jazz, modern, some musical theater.
Yay! It's my
keep it
undergraduate.
Nice. Yeah. It
That's
even
why
went into dance technology, which is a lot of fun. But yeah.
What exactly is dance technology?
Does it help you dance? Because I could use that. I could use that dance technology.
I mean, so it's kind of a really broad field of study. I'm sure there are some things that will video watch you and analyze your movements through machine learning and give you hints. But the stuff that I was looking at, I was using an Xbox Connect to try to track your movements.
Oh, that's cool.
I did two different things with that. One was to notate and write down what you were doing using this special dance notation. And then the other was a performance piece where the background projection behind the dancer was determined by the movements.
I think I've seen things like that. That's really outstanding.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating.
It's a lot of fun.
So let's talk about some other fun things like developing code from a test-driven point of view. I figure that's what we're here to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to try to not let my little iOS eyes gloss over today because I do appreciate the concepts of test-driven development. Can you give us the 20,000-foot view for somebody who has not done TDD before, what that means?
Yes, absolutely. One thing that you might be happy to hear, since you'll be here for this whole time listening, is that at the root, it's a software development process. Mm-hmm. So it's more of a way of thinking and a way of writing your code that can be applied no matter what platform you're working on, whether you're doing mobile, web, embedded, anything else. Writing for an Xbox Connect to use in a dance performance. You can use test-driven development for all of those things. And really the TLDR of it is that you write tests for your code before you write the actual code. That way you have tests for it. The tests are testing what it is they need to test. And then they're there for you in the future as well.
So you're basically flipping the idea of the unit test on its head.
A little bit, yeah, and that you kind of you write the test before you write the code. And yeah, you're writing a unit test just in a different order.
So how do you begin to see the test point of view from the code point of view? How do you begin writing from a test point of view?
I'll be honest, it sometimes takes practice to try to train your brain to kind of think that way. And I found for me, it does help if you do start writing code first and then write tests. And then you're like, okay, I know how to write tests now. And then you kind of start thinking about, okay, what are the requirements for this next piece of code that I need to write? I need a function that returns a user from the repository. Okay, I can write a test that tests that it returns a user from the repository, rather than like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just writing this use case. It just says show the user on the screen. But once you start breaking it down into smaller and smaller parts, rather than show the user on the profile screen, be like, okay, in order to get the user, I need to fetch the user. Okay, I need to write a use case for that. What does this use case need to do? It needs to return a user from the repository. Okay, that is small enough that I've done that kind of test before. I can write that test.
What's the benefit of practicing test-driven development versus, I think, what people might be more familiar with of just like writing code and then writing tests? Like, why do TDD versus non-TDD?
There's a couple of different reasons. One is it kind of helps keep you on track. It keeps you like from going like being like, oh, well, I'll need this later. I might as well do this now. It helps keep you really focused, and you're writing tests for the thing. You're only writing the code for that thing. So you're not like going off writing extra code that you might find that you forgot to write tests for later. Because in hindsight, it's really easy to forget a test for a case, where if you're writing the test first, you know you have the test for it. Yeah, it also helps make sure that like it enforces that you always have tests with your code.
Oh, that makes sense, because you since you're writing the test first,
right,
you have to have tests, because otherwise you don't have code.
Exactly. If you're writing the code first, it's so easy to be like, oh, I'll write the test later. Later never happens.
Later never happens.
No,
unless you have someone really pestering you when they review your PRs. Later never happens.
Never.
Later becomes your technical debt.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Later so becomes being annoyed in 3 years that none of your code has any tests.
Right, exactly. And then you have to figure out how to do TDD with legacy code, which is something we can talk about once we get what TDD is under our belt.
Right. So TDD is basically taking the objective and writing a test that basically, I guess that test is going to fail until you then go write the code.
Exactly. That's the whole point. That's another good point about why TDD can be better than writing the test after, because you've seen the test fail, you know it works. It has happened so many times to me where I've written the test after I've written the code. I'm like, cool, it's passing. And then later I found out it wasn't actually testing anything.
Those are my favorite tests.
They're always great. Yeah, but if you write it and you see it fail, you know it's testing something. And if you see it pass later, after you write the code that you're supposed to write, you're like, okay, it's testing what I want it to test. And that's something I'd recommend too, like if you are writing your tests after you write your code, because you're like still learning, like getting that intuition about what kinds of tests you need maybe. Or you just don't understand the problem well enough yet to write those tests. After you write the tests and it's green, change something in your code to make sure you see it fail, so you know it's doing its job.
So you're actually aiming for the unhappy path.
Right. You want to see your tests fail. And of course, make them green after. But
you want to see them fail so that you can then see them.
So you're confident in that green.
That makes sense. Okay. I like that. The being confident in your green rather than just, you got a green, feel free to move on. You may not be right.
Yeah. So one of the things that's kind of kept me from exploring TDD, at least in the Android world, is if I don't have the code yet, my IDE is yelling at me with lots of red squigglies that method doesn't exist, or that class doesn't exist. How do you get around that? Or like, do you actually just start with zero code and tests, or do you make some of the like basic shapes of the code and then write the tests? Or how do you get around Android Studio being angry?
Yeah. So because, especially like with strongly typed compiled languages like Java and Kotlin, it really matters if that method or that class is there. So part of that first step is not only writing the test, but the minimum amount of code to make it pass. So maybe that's setting up just like the shape of the class with just that function that you need with nothing in it. Maybe it has to return like a dummy value, like null or an empty string or something. But the main point there is that like you don't have the logic in it yet because you want to see that test fail. And with that, if that's something that's really hard to do, then that could be a sign that's like maybe you don't have any logic in that method, which might be a sign maybe you don't need to test that method. Maybe that's the equivalent of testing a getter, which like...
You don't test all your getters?
I don't. I don't have the CI minutes for that.
That makes a lot of sense then. That's something that's been a big block for me. It's just, I think I've started trying some TDD and I've seen red squigglies and just been like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm going to go back to my comfort zone.
So we're talking about unit tests, but and I want to have you briefly talk about the testing pyramid. Unit tests are not the only tests that we have to deal with here.
Right. You can use TDD with a whole bunch of different types of tests.
So what exactly are they talking about when they talk about the testing pyramid?
So the testing pyramid kind of goes over a few different types of tests and how many of them that you should have. We've mostly talked about unit tests here, and those are usually testing one small little unit. Usually it's like one method and one class and like one case of that. So like maybe like one branch of it. They're very small, they're very focused, they're very fast, and you want the most amount of these. On top of that, the next step of the pyramid, so like the middle part, is integration tests. And these kind of tests that different parts of your app work together. Sometimes they can test how your code interacts with another library or framework or with Android. This is where the lines start to get a little bit fuzzy. Some people consider UI tests to be part of integration tests. My idea is just if it is testing multiple different things, how they interact with each other, because even though a unit of your code is working correctly, that doesn't mean it's interacting with like other classes correctly. And those take a little bit longer. They're a little bit bigger, especially if they are interacting with the Android framework or using Verbal Electric to mock out the Android framework. And then on top of that is end-to-end tests or UI tests. This is where some people put UI test in integration. Some of them put them in the top part of like UI/end-to-end. And UI tests are testing your UI. They're opening the screen on a phone. It's clicking around on stuff, verifying that the views are there. And then end-to-end tests will test like going through multiple screens. They're often set up to hit the network when other tests are not, because the majority of your tests you don't want to hit the network because the network is flaky. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So for pretty much all your tests, except for maybe some end-to-end tests, you don't want to hit the network. And on top of it being undependable, it's really slow, and you're not going to want to sit there and run those tests all the time, whether that's on your own machine when you're trying to get actual work done, or if that's on a CI server where you're paying for minutes. or simply waiting for it to run so you can merge a PR.
Oh, I know that game.
Yeah. So with UI tests,
so many buzzwords to catch up on.
Yeah.
yeah. So between UI tests, integration tests, and end-to-end tests, Google recommends that like 70% of your tests are unit tests, 20% are integration tests, and 10 are end-to-end tests. Mm-hmm. I've never measured exactly how many I have. I just know, okay, most of my tests I want to be unit tests. And if I have so many UI tests that I'm not running them, then I have too many.
Oh, that's a good measure. I like that. If I have so many that I'm no longer willing to like run the test suite, then that's too much.
Yeah, like one way or another. Because the point of tests is so that you'll run them, especially with test-driven development. Because like you're writing a test, you're running it. You're writing code, you're running the test. You're refactoring, you're running the test. You're writing another test, you're running the test. So it's a pain to do that when you have tests that take a long time to run.
Now, one of the things you mentioned was RoboElectric. Can you give a quick explanation for more people new to the platform of what that is?
Yes. Kind of the like highest level explanation that I can give is it's a way to mock out the Android framework so that you can basically run a unit test without actually loading like all of Android. So a way to unit test alongside Android code without having to like run it on an emulator. So you can do it locally on your machine. You don't have to build a whole APK, push it up to the emulator. It just kind of like mocks out the context of like the world that you are running your app in.
So would I, if I'm using RoboElectric in my tests, can you get like an activity or a fragment through RoboElectric, or is it for like a different layer of stuff?
This recently changed, but I'll explain it the best that I can from what I've learned from it. But fairly recent in RoboElectric version 4, or RoboElectric 4.0, they made it so that you can start doing even UI tests with RoboElectric. You have to use like specific like support libraries with it, specific test libraries. Like you have to use all of like the new Android X, I don't remember what they're calling it, like activity scenario, I think. It's a different way to basically launch your tests that it looks a lot cleaner. I've looked at it. I just don't remember the name right now. But they updated their like Espresso UI testing library. So like the latest versions of those with the latest versions of RoboElectric makes it that you can run those UI tests both like locally and on like a device.
Oh, wow. That sounds amazing.
I'm pretty sure there's some limitations. Like, I don't know if you can get like GPS and stuff like that in like location, and I don't know what else, but like stuff that's more tied to hardware. But stuff like this is a screen that shows stuff. You can do that with RoboElectric. The benefits to that is it's faster. It's different than, it's slightly less reliable than running on an actual device because there's so many different devices out there that Android behaves differently on. But for like, especially if you're doing like test-driven development and just like you're having to run something more often, then it's a nice tool to have.
So that's, you mentioned like not wanting to have maybe so many UI tests that running the test suite is super slow when you're doing TDD. When you're going through the normal, write a test, write your code, make sure the test passes, are you typically running like the whole test suite, or are you just like, are you running UI tests every time you run through that flow, or is it just like the singular tests that you've written? I
usually run just the singular test that I've written, and then like every so often I'll run the rest of it just to make sure I didn't break them. But just for like to be quick, I run just the test of like what I'm focusing on at that time, and maybe one or two other tests if they're like directly related to what I'm doing. And that's where it helps to have like focused test files where it's not like, here are all of my tests for the whole project in this file. We're always going to run them all at once.
You mean I shouldn't have my test.kt file up and running?
I mean, you could. I won't stop you, but you know, if it
well, then I'm going to do it.
If it keeps you from running them, no.
If your project gets big enough, I having worked on Microsoft Office, there was quick tests, and then there was the day-long integration test.
Oh yeah.
And you just basically said, okay, here's a major build, step away and wait to see what breaks. So one of the things that comes up in testing, and this may not just necessarily be TDD, but testing in general, is mocking and stubbing. Yes. Can you talk about them and what the difference is between them?
I'll do the best that I can. It's one of those things that I feel like I have to look it up every single time I need to know the difference.
And there's no shame in saying in that.
I will share this, that like for mocks, I usually think of those as a way to know that something was called on like a dependency class. So you can create like a mock of, we'll use the same example I was using before, create a mock of your repository that you pass into your use case. And then when you're testing that use case, you can say, was get users called on the repository? Because it should have been. So that is one of those ideas. Another is stubbing that you mentioned. And I think of that one as when you can often, like, I use mocks and stubs as the same object because it seems to work that way with Mockito, with the way that I've been using it. And Mockito is just a library for mocking and stubbing. I think of stubbing as saying, when I call this method, we'll say on the repository, I want it to return this user. So that instead of the repository actually calling into the database, actually calling into the network, it's skipping that step and just returning what you want it to return, because when you're unit testing your use case, you only want to unit test the use case, only the code in that class, not the class in the repository. You don't want to test the stuff in the database or the network. So you want to have a way to bypass all of that. And one way of bypassing that is creating those stubs and be like, okay, stub out this method. Don't actually reach out to the database. Just return this user that I give you. And that helps keep your unit tests a bit more contained.
Now, eventually you're going to want to test your persistent storage. You're going to want to test your network. And I know we talked about the end-to-end testing, but how do you write a test, a TDD test around persistent storage or around the network behavior?
That is probably one of the hardest things.
Well, I'm glad I asked.
Yes. Starting with the network, there's a couple of ways to look at this. One is if you actually feel like you need to call the network, is setting your test up to try to call an endpoint that you know will always return the same thing, at least as far as your test is concerned. So maybe instead of calling something to get a random list of recipes, you call to get a specific list of recipes. So that's one way. Another is really truly evaluating if you feel like you need that full test all the way to the network layer. There are libraries like Mock Web Server that you can basically say, when we call this URL, return this JSON. And that's probably like the closest you can get to a real network call without actually making a network call.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a tool that I really like. That one, it speeds up your test. Two, it's really close to the actual thing. No, it won't catch if the API changes and your code doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully you'll probably find that pretty fast anyway.
You always do.
Yeah. It's always in the middle of the night too.
Because somebody decided to change it on the server end and didn't decide to tell the clients.
Tested it on the website. That's what I found. Worked on the website.
Right. Exactly. So if you do feel like you're in a place that you need to test for that, then actually hitting the network can be useful. If what the project that you're working on feels safe enough that you don't need that, then using mock web server is a good alternative.
Mock web server.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
We'll include information like that, like information about Mockito, information about mock web server in the show notes so that people can look those things up.
Great.
As well as, obviously, Android Test-Driven Development by Tutorials, which was a book that Victoria is one of the co-authors of.
Yes, a lot of these things that I'm saying you will also find in that book. Yeah. And let's see. Going back to the networking, there's kind of like, or not networking, persistent storage. This one, there's a few different options for, especially since there's a few different types of persistent storage, whether that's shared preferences or maybe like a room database. And depending on what you're using for storage, there's some different options. For things like room, they provide an in-memory database that you can use that will like basically die at the end of your test, so you don't have to worry about it infecting whatever else is on your device. I say
Not thrilled with
infecting, no.
Yeah, not thrilled with the word infecting right now.
Impacting.
That's good. That's better.
Yes.
Yeah, that's good. That was a good pitch.
Impacting the rest of your test, because if you want to test what the behavior is when your database is empty, then it's not going to do well if you already have stuff in your database. So using an in-memory database just kind of has a separate contained little database that's used for each test. It's reset for every test, and that helps your tests be more reliable. You can run them in any order, which is important because the tests shouldn't be dependent on each other in the order that they're run in. There's a couple of different like database libraries that have similar things. When you're doing stuff like shared preferences, that's a bit trickier because as far as I know, there isn't something like that. So you can either make the decision to mock out a layer earlier and be like, okay, we're just not going to use the real thing, or just make sure you're running on a testing device that it's okay if you mess with shared preferences. There's ways to clear it at the beginning and end of every test so everything resets. And you can also use setup and tear down to be like, okay, these are the defaults that I want, or for this specific test, I need to make sure this is already set in shared preferences. So that one's a little bit trickier just because you are working with the real shared preferences in the app. So that can be trickier, but hopefully you're working with a separate build or separate device than
I like it.
what you're using personally.
Do you so one of the things that I've struggled with as an Android developer is kind of getting that like integration layer up and running. I think that I've become decent at writing unit tests, but I don't think I've figured out how to really write good tests that marry multiple systems. Like, for example, I'll write tests for, say, my view models, like the little companions to views or whatever.
Yeah.
But kind of how a view model might interact with, a different view model for a new activity or new fragment, or how it actually interacts with a repository or a use case, like how the whole system works together. I don't feel like I have a good answer for that yet. Have you figured out any sort of like tips and tricks to actually getting sort of those glue layers tested?
Yeah, and this has changed a bit. Is like I've gone back and forth along like the spectrum of what is an integration test. Right now, I'm using like a UI test for a single like fragment, say, or a single view. And it's taken a lot of learning more about our dependency injection so that we can open that screen like normal. But things like down like by the network layer, I try to mock that out for an integration test because I don't want it hitting the network. So usually like at the repository or network layer, I want to mock that out. But that can be hard in an integration test. So the biggest thing there is like learning what testing tools your dependency injection is using, and if you're not using dependency injection, to learn how to add dependency injection to your app, because it really does help a lot with testing. Like two of the biggest things that helps when you need to write like UI and integration tests into your app are having dependency injection and like a mindful architecture.
Yeah, I think that's one of the spots where there's kind of been this like whole architecture wave in Android development, right? Where people figured out like, hey, maybe we should plan out these apps more than zero. And I think it does feel like testing has been like the pusher. Like, how can I test stuff? Feels like such a fundamental push with all the architecture stuff that's been going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you like do start having that habit of trying to write tests and everything, it encourages even more like maintainable and testable architecture. Because a lot of the things that make an architecture maintainable also make it testable.
Yeah.
So they kind of like help each other out, where it's like, if you're writing maintainable code, it's easier to test. And if you're writing tests, you want to write more maintainable code.
Yeah.
Kind of like,
I think that was like a huge revelation for me, because I was confused about why people were doing this dependency injection stuff, because it just felt like a lot of code for rushable gains. And then as soon as you go to write some tests, you're like, oh, okay, I get it. I get all of it.
Yeah. I remember when I had that moment, I was like writing this small little sample app, and I was like, it's a small little app. I'm not going to put in dependency injection. Okay, let me go write tests. Oh.
I want 120% code coverage, and I want unit tests on the unit tests. So we call it test-driven development, and that is we write the tests to figure out how to write the code. Does this basically mean that I can only use TDD on new code?
No. So you do write the test first, but you don't only write the test first when you're writing new code. You can also write the test first if you're going to fix a bug. So if you find a bug, you write a failing test for what the behavior is supposed to be that it's not meeting. And then it's failing, and then you fix the bug, and then it's passing. Another is to do with refactoring. And how many times, I know I've refactored so many times where I'm like, this feels dangerous. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm refactoring.
I'm on the iOS world where Swift 2 to Swift 3 meant a complete rewrite.
Yeah. But yeah, so if you like write tests around, okay, this is the expected behavior of what we already have, write tests for it. And depending on how the code's architected, you might have to like go up like a level. Like it might need to be closer to an end-to-end or integration, depending on the refactorings that you need to do, or like the existing architecture that maybe you're trying to make more testable. So that once you write those tests, and this is the exception where they might pass when you first write them, still try to tweak something to make sure they fail, just so you know they're testing the right thing. But then you can start refactoring, and you have something that will tell you if you broke something while you were refactoring, rather than clicking around in the app. Well, I think it still works the same way.
Yeah, regression testing is definitely necessary to make sure you haven't broken anything that was working before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I know that can be difficult, especially with legacy apps that don't have any of this architecture.
Yeah.
I know it can be easier to like, even though it's set, we say like, do mostly unit tests. Well, what if it's not architected in a way you can do unit tests?
Yeah.
Then like, okay, you start with your like end-to-end or like UI test at like whatever level you can. Just kind of like look at what your constraints are. Where can you cut a line so that it's as small as possible, but it may need to be bigger. Then you have those tests, and then you can refactor that into smaller parts. And then once you have your smaller parts, you can reevaluate. Can you write smaller unit tests for those parts and maybe delete some of your bigger tests, because deleting tests can feel great. Deleting code in general. I love it when I like refactor something and it's like, okay, that class, delete. We have fresh new Kotlin code and that Java code is gone.
Such a good feeling. So good.
So yeah, and that's basically like the strangler pattern, where you like start with like a little like branch of your code, you kind of like strangle it with tests. Then like underneath that you can like rewrite it and refactor it as you please, and you're like, I know it's still working because those tests are there. Then you can move on to the next part. It's a little bit less daunting.
What a nefarious name for for such a nice pattern.
I think it was like named after these like really cool vines that kind of like wrap themselves around a tree, and then like eventually like it's just the shape of the vines, because I don't know, I have to look at it again. I saw it once. I think Lance wrote about it in our book, and it's a really cool plant.
Basically, the ideas of TDD sound fairly straightforward, but you did say that climbing into it can be a bit difficult. Talk about the process of learning it and getting better at it.
Yeah, writing tests really, it can feel like an art. Like you will try and fail. You won't know what to test. You won't know like how to test it. And a lot of that is just like going in and trying and being willing to make those mistakes. Sometimes you'll write tests that give false positives. Sometimes you'll write tests that later you find out maybe don't have the same value or are brittle.
Brittle.
Yes, where like you might make changes in the code that you feel like shouldn't break the test because everything is still working in the app.
I always refer to the 6 stages of debugging, which starts from, I don't see why this isn't working. It works on my machine. It doesn't work. How did that ever work? Oh, I see. It should never have worked in the first place.
Yeah. But yeah, my favorite like example of like a brittle test that is specifically in UI test is like, you have a test that this button should read okay, and it says the letters okay, and you're like, oh, okay, cool, I have a test for this. And then later they're like, okay, you need to change the copy to say okay, AY, or got it. And then your test fails. You're like, but the button is what it's supposed to be. Like, this shouldn't be failing. And there's like ways to like guard against that. Like for
you mean you've hard coded your strings and you don't have a constant of strings that you're
right?
Oh, shame.
Right, exactly. It's like kind of the way around that is to use your like string resources instead of hard coding it into your app. But that's like a simple like way to understand like what a brittle test could look like. And as you write more tests, you like start to get more intuition about what tests are valuable, what tests might be brittle, how you can stop it from being brittle. But I recommend at the beginning just like write all the tests, and as that intuition comes, then you can start being like, okay, maybe we don't need this test. Once you've like grown that intuition. Because in most cases, there's just not enough tests.
Speaking of enough tests, I know that Alex has actually taken some of the stuff we've done in previous weeks. He's been looking at the coroutines. And I'm curious to hear how that's going and how you might consider adding in some of the TDD now that you've got that under your belt.
Yeah. So I've been the app that I'm currently working on. It recently started migrating from doing all of our sort of threading stuff with RxJava to doing a lot of it with coroutines. And this has kind of been my first opportunity to really work professionally with coroutines. And it's been an interesting ride. So there's been a lot of like really fun parts where there's kind of some magic that you can do, that we learned about in a previous episode. But like delaying, being able to just say, hey, I'd like to sleep for a second and have it not be an anti-pattern is a really cool thing to be able to do. But there's definitely been some stumbling blocks, and especially when it comes to testing. So there's these. So when I would use RxJava, I would usually do stuff like pass in, use dependency injection to send my RxJava schedulers in, so I could control like what thread stuff is running on, so that in my tests, I could just have it all run in a single thread, and I'd know that everything was synchronous. And there's mechanisms to kind of do that with coroutines, but instead of sort of passing things through into the classes that are utilizing coroutines, there's a few different sort of magic options. There's a thing where you can just like globally assign the main dispatcher to be, whatever you choose. And then there are interesting like testing blocks. Like there's one called run blocking test, which kind of swaps some stuff out under the hood. And it's the sort of thing where it works really well 90% of the time. And then I spend all of the time that I gained from coroutines trying to debug the other 10% of the time. So it's been quite a journey. It's definitely something that I'm excited to learn a lot more about, but there's definitely been some stumbling blocks, especially when it comes to testing. So
Stumbling blocks.
I'm having fun.
Stumbling blocks in your coroutine code. Bad pun.
Terrible. Sign off.
I think at that point we should thank Victoria for joining us on the show today. It has been very informative to learn about test-driven development, especially because I know it's something that I've been wanting to do on my platform as well, and I know it's much of what is probably in that book will work for me as well. I'm not even sure if there is a test-driven developments for iOS by tutorials. There probably there is one.
Yes.
Okay. I probably will look at take two. I probably will look through this book as well as iOS test-driven development by tutorials, because it'll be a little more applicable to my side of things. But it's good to know that test-driven development is very usable on all those platforms. Victoria, again, I really want to thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been so much fun.
Victoria, you can find on Twitter at ttgonda, that's Gonda. Alex and I are rarely on Twitter, but can be found there. Alex Sullivan 444. I'm Podcast Dru, that's DRU. In 2 weeks, we will have Andy Pereira on the show to talk about Catalyst. Catalyst, that wonderful way to suddenly have your iOS app run on the Mac. 2 weeks after that, our next Android episode, Brian Capitz is going to be on talking about Flutter, and we've all been waiting about that. It's that inventive way to get Android apps working on your iOS and vice versa and things like that. It's a very interesting thing. For those of you listening to the podcast, we invite you to look for this episode in about 2 weeks on YouTube. The video episode will contain some of the information we left on the cutting room floor and a little bit more of a casual after show that we'll carry on shortly with our guest. We hope you check it out. In the meantime, we head back to the Emerald Castle. Ray, back to you.
And that's a wrap. Thanks again, everybody, for listening to the RayWenderlich.com podcast. We hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to leave a rating on iTunes. See you next time.
Alex, please tell me you started your audio recording today.
I started my audio recording. I don't appreciate that. That's definitely a fear that I have every time. Because the first episode, like the meet the host episode, I started that audio file. I'm like 90% sure about it. So now whenever I start QuickTime, 90%. Now whenever I start QuickTime, I'm like, you started it, right, Alex? You see it ticking. You see the volume indicators. All that stuff.
So one of the topics I wanted to chase back to, Victoria, we really didn't talk about the idea of testing threads. How do you, is that just more mocking and stubbing, or does that become a special kind of nightmare unto itself?
Mostly a nightmare. It a little bit depends on like what level you're testing at. If it's more of like a unit test, depending on what sort of threading you're using, if you're using like RX Java, maybe you architect your code that you pass in what scheduler you're using, so you're always using the same thread. If you're using coroutines, I'm guessing they have something similar. I honestly haven't used coroutines. And then like it gets more complicated when you get to UI tests, because the more end-to-end you want them to be, the less like you're trying to like change stuff like at different layers. And then you start getting into some of the more complex parts of espresso where you're like, okay, we want to wait for this thing to happen before you keep going.
Yeah, I've got that.
It's like the idling resource stuff, right?
Yeah.
I've got that on the Apple side.
Yeah.
It was very funny.
Does it work well on the Apple side?
It's not bad it's not bad.
Nice.
It's easier on things like completion handlers, where you basically say, I'm going to go forth, and until something happens or a semaphore gets hit, hold on to the test there, and then complete it. I'm glad that we actually cut to just Alex's shot, because when I mentioned coroutines, Victoria, you started to go a little white, because it was like, oh no, we're not talking about that. I'm not here to talk about that today.
Yeah, I know practically nothing about coroutines. I want to learn more. I haven't had the practical application for it, and the list of things to learn is
always.
My arms aren't long enough.
Always giant, yeah.
Think about our position here on the show. Every 2 weeks, it's like, this is a nifty new technology. I'll get really excited until 2 weeks from now when I have another new nifty technology.
Throw it on the pile.
Right.
This is a complete ADHD podcast. It's like, ooh, new shiny. Ooh, new shiny.
Yeah, absolutely. Constantly.
I'm sure.
So I'm gonna completely change gears on you and ask about the games on the shelf. What is your favorite game currently?
It does change all of the time, depending on a lot of like
how bored you get with them after you play them.
Right, and like if I get a shiny new game. Recently, I've been enjoying the Dark Souls board game just because I'm just starting to learn the strategy behind it.
There's a Dark Souls board game?
I'm not even like a video game person, but like the mechanics of the board game are just fun. But we just got a new board game last weekend that I haven't played yet, and I know nothing about. It's called Catacombs, and I'm excited to try it. I know nothing about it, but I'm still really excited about it.
One of the ones that I just got turned on to is called Azul.
That one's fun.
I love Azul. It's because I love it's got little artistic tiles, and it seems so simple until you start playing it, and then you realize, oh, this is a strategy game. That this is a screw your other player game, and it is deceptively easy. It is deceptively vicious. And more times than not, somebody will take tiles out of the pile, and you'll hear everybody else at the table going, "Oh, you bastard!"
Yeah, it is that game. It's like the instructions are just like, "Oh, we're just replacing pretty tiles on a board," and then you get into it, and you're like, "Don't you dare take that pile of tiles! I want it."
Oh no, I got to take 7 tiles out of the center. I am so screwed.
Yeah.
It's also one of those games where you actually think you're winning the game, and then you actually count up at the end, and it's like, oh no, I'm in the worst shape than everybody else in the game.
Oh no, I'm in last place.
And it's not, like I said, it's not a difficult game. Have you come across, Victoria, a game called TAK, T-A-K?
No.
Oh, check that one out online. That is it's a very pretty game, and it also
TAK? So I don't forget.
might be TAK game.
Yeah. Oh, that is pretty.
Dead air, as we yeah, keep an eye. The website I was trying to remember was boardgamearena.com. It's basically it's basically board games. It's not every board game, but it's got a good selection of games. It's free for a lot of the games, but for some of the games there's a very minimal drop in the minimal amount of money to pay to get all of the games and the special features. I mean, we're talking like $2 a month kind of thing.
Oh, that's nice.
Worth it.
How do they make money? How do you make money?
Oh, they probably are getting. They're probably getting money from all of the game publishers saying, "Oh yeah, put my game up there."
Oh, that's interesting. Just as like an advertisement form for the games. That's a great idea.
Yeah. So it's boardgamearena.com. If you want to add me on as a friend or send me out for a game, it's LORDANDREI. That's right, Andre, not Drew. Oh God, I've said it on the show. And now everybody who's watching the show is like, I'm going to send him a game request.
Write that down. I got deep into, I think this is like old hat and board game news, but me and a friend group got really deep into constantly playing Secret Hitler all the time.
I've never heard of it.
Secret Hitler?
It's the orange box behind me.
It's fantastic. It's a great game to lose friends. It's like Risk in that sense that you like at the end of it you no longer want to speak to each other and the night needs to be over because everyone's angry.
I feel like I'm like the like outlier where it's like everyone I know loves Secret Hitler, but like I'm really bad at lying, and that's a game that you want to be good at lying in. So then I'm just going to sit here quiet because everything that I say is the truth, and I'm going to spoil everything.
Yeah. I found that I figured out, it's horrible, but I'm pretty sure I figured out how to lie via Secret Hitler. And the trick is to just bluntly state the exact opposite of the truth, or like immediately accuse somebody. Like, call someone out as lying in what they're doing and just dig in. You really see why politicians do it so often.
So really, it's just a study of how to be a politician.
It really is. It really is.
One of the games along those lines that I really got into is Saboteur, which is you basically are putting down map pieces in a mine, and one of the players, or sometimes more than one of the players, is a saboteur. You're all trying to find your way to the gold, and the saboteur is trying to mess that up along the way. And if you run out of the cards before getting to the gold, the saboteur wins the points, and if you get to the gold, then the people who aren't the saboteur split the points.
Yeah.
But it's nice. The site's also got this has suddenly become an advertisement for a website. But it's also got hearts on there and other really simple card games.
Like card games.
I love hearts. It's got backgammon.
I know how to play hearts.
That 5-die rolling game that I think is trademarked.
I always saw that game like at every relative's home and been like, I wonder how you play that. And never learned to play. And it's never been brought up at any point in time. It's just always present. Yeah.
Backgammon or Yahtzee?
Backgammon, I think.
Backgammon.
Yeah.
Backgammon's not that bad.
I like backgammon. It's a nice game.
Oh, then I'll have to challenge you at some point to a game.
All right. You're on.
So be it. Yeah. All right. So let's see. What other topics haven't we hit yet? We've hit gaming. We've hit dance. We've hit threading. I always love bringing up threading because I remember. I will always remember the interview where the guy asked me on the phone. It's like, so do you like threading? And I was like, does anybody like threading?
You're like,
I approach it. I approach it with horrible fear, but I'll do it.
Right. There's like someone out there who did like their thesis on threading who is absolutely in love with it.
Oh God, yeah.
God.
I always know when I've got one of those people. It's like, look, I can point you to podcasts. Go do a talk for 45 minutes.
Yeah.
With all due respect, I mean, I'm not saying.
Oh yeah.
I am
sure.
very thankful that there are people who are excited about it so that they can figure out the hard parts.
exactly. Yeah, they
I'm
can do all the stuff.
Thankful for those people.
Well, later this season, we're going to be talking about cryptocurrency, and that is one of those things that I find absolutely fascinating. But the level of mathematics and understanding of how that technology works is almost black box to me.
Mm-hmm.
We had at the consultancy I used to work at, they had a project where they were implementing, I don't remember an Ethereum client.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like in Phoenix, or Elixir, sorry, the language Elixir. And that was like a company paid the consultancy to create an implementation of Ethereum in Elixir. And it was the most fascinating thing in the world listening to them talk, because you would just go off this white paper. Like they would have the white papers for how Ethereum works, and they would just be going through that, implementing things. And apparently there's this like whole giant test suite. Really interesting stuff. And I know nothing about any of it.
And then you need a machine that is like a Mac Pro run up to the max to be able to actually make any money off of these things.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
All right. Let's see. Is there anything else we want to touch on? I mean, it's completely free at this point. What are you binging during shelter in place?
I'm not binging.
I watch very little TV to begin with, but I did just finally start watching Black Mirror, which is probably the worst time to start watching it with everything going on.
Oh, God, yeah.
But it's also really interesting, even how scary it is.
I need a TV show. How about something apocalyptic?
Yeah. Oh, apt.
Possibly with underlying conspiracy, yeah.
Yes.
But it's a fantastic show.
It is. It's phenomenal.
Right.
That's one of those shows that I like. I watch an episode and then I walk away for a month.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, that's about how long it is between when I watch episodes. Like, it's usually like I watch like an episode a week. I'm really bad at watching TV.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good thing to be bad at. I envy that. I'm really good at watching TV.
Well, now that my company has me like working with an India team, so I'm basically up at 6 a.m. to be sitting in my chair at 6:30, 7 o'clock. I go to sleep at 9. I don't have time for television. I have time. I'm not 23 anymore. I need sleep. Oh, I know a question I completely forgot to ask. And Victoria, going to TDD and all of the different things that are available on Android, all the different tools and the like, is there anything that you would love to see Google add in to make testing and test-driven development, anything you'd like to see Google add in?
Ooh, that's a really good question.
Santa Code Clause.
Yeah. I really just want them to release nitrogen.
What is nitrogen?
What that is, from my understanding, they've said very little. But it's basically like a way to like seamlessly run your tests in different environments. Like I mentioned with Roboelectric that you can like run it on your device or locally as a UI test. But right now, in order to like do that with default configuration, like you'd have to completely change where the tests live in your app without like extra work. But like with Project Nitrogen, it's supposed to make it easier to like run it locally, run it on a device, run it on CI, run it wherever. Just a lot easier. That's basically all the information I have on that, and even that could be wrong. But it's something.
Basically, it's a floating code word for a possible new technology.
Yeah, and they've been talking about it for like, I feel like maybe even like 2 years, where they're like, "Oh yeah, we're still working on this. It's going to be really cool." I'm like,
yeah,
come on.
We'll watch for it at Google. Oh, no, we won't.
Too soon.
Too soon. Too soon. It's going to be a hard year, this one.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. I think we've got lots of material here. Victoria, I want to thank you for staying for the YouTube after show.
Thank you.
And I really thank you for your time on the show. It has been a pleasure.
Awesome.
And we would love to have you back anytime.
Thank you so much.
Alex, thank you again for all of your time and your work and your knowledge in Android so that I don't have to come up with lots of questions that I don't know. And that's going to do it for me. We will head back to the recorded version of the Emerald Castle and send it all the way back to Ray. Thanks a lot, folks. See you in 2 weeks.
Yep.
See ya.